Hello, and welcome to Let's Talk Bible. I'm Sonny Childs. Okay, guys, now we're going to move on from the context dealing with conflict resolution into another area of the Sermon on the Mount. This one's about adultery, and we'll cover it in two different recordings. So first of all, let's look at Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 and 28, and then next time we'll look at 29 through 30. 27 and 28 reads as follows. You have heard that it was said, you should not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So what is heart adultery anyhow? Well, he obviously tells us here in this context what it is, and I'll give you 3 points. Looks, woman, and lustfully. 3 elements, if you will, to heart adultery. First of all, and I think you're going to see in all 3 of these words that there's more to it than just the specific word. In fact, I think it's a specific illustration of a broad principle. Number 1, looks. First thing I'd like to suggest is that this is more about the intent to find sexual arousal than it is about looking. Because that kind of activity, sin, doesn't always require looking at something. And so I think that there's a specific word being used for a general principle that Jesus is trying to apply here, and that is that we need to guard ourselves against sexual arousal, in this case, intentional sexual arousal that's inappropriate. And so first of all, he says that we need to be careful because anyone who looks, uses their eyesight in this particular illustration, but I think it's broader than that. Anyone who is intentionally seeking out sexual arousal inappropriately, that person needs to be careful because of what he's going to say later on. Make it real application for you then. Guard intent. Guard your intent. Number 2, notice that he says here, anyone who looks at a woman. Again, I think he's using a specific word for a general principle. In most cultures throughout history, the sexual relationship has been dominated by a relationship between a man and a woman. I think in all cultures, but I'll say certainly in most cultures throughout history, the idea of homosexuality was not just a perversion, it was outside the norm completely, in that it's not something that logically takes a person to a place that one would want to go with regards to procreation, even healthy families, that kind of things. Homosexuality is almost always dominated by self-pleasure. And so when you understand that, and you realize that heterosexuality was designed by God to go beyond self-pleasure, it was to go to a service for the world, i.e., where you have procreation taking place, then you have to come back to this specific word. When he says anybody looks at a woman, he's not just limiting it to women, because obviously women can lust after men, and even in a heterosexual relationship. But what I want to do is broaden this to suggest to you that lust for anything, anyone specifically outside the marriage bond of a heterosexual relationship, because it doesn't matter that our Supreme Court has validated the homosexual marriage. What does the Bible say? This is, by the way, remember, let's talk Bible, not let's talk Supreme Court rulings. Then you recognize that in what he's saying here is that lust for anyone outside the appropriate relationship that God has deemed acceptable, then that's inappropriate, and it is condemned of God. Then number 3, he is going to say, lustfully. We need to look at that word lustfully. When I was a young man, I was a sports fanatic and played all of the major sports and did quite well. But it was a difficult time for me because in all the major sports, there's often cheerleaders. And I was a typical male. I guess I still am a typical male. But the female form and figure was attractive, etc. And being a Christian and knowing that I should control my mind and my thoughts, it made it very difficult for me on those long bus rides home after, a basketball game, football game, whatever it was. And you got the cheerleaders riding on the same bus with you, and they're in those really, really, really short skirts. You know what I'm talking about? It was a tough time for me because I was in that time. I wasn't married yet, obviously, and lust. What was lust? And trying to define that for me. I really, really appreciated my father during these years because, as good fathers would do, he sat me down and he discussed that part of my life. But he said something to me that I've shared with you before, but it's a phrase I'll always remember. You can't keep the birds from flying over your head, but you can keep them from building a nest in your hair. Lust is an intent of the heart. In fact, I really like what the NIV Bible does in the footnote for this particular verse. Let me read it to you. This is not a passing glance, but a willful, calculated stare that arouses sexual desire. In other words, lust is not just a fleeting moment, but it's when you pull up to the computer and you decide, I am going to look at that picture. It's when you're passing that billboard with that, from that tanning salon with that girl in her bikini, and instead of it just going by, you actually pull into the parking lot adjacent and you kind of look at it for a while. See, lust is more of an ongoing intent of the heart. Now, that helped me as a young man going through puberty because it told me that just because I happened to see one of those girls on the bus who's not dressed up modestly, and I happen to glance over there and catch a sight of her kneecap or whatever it may be, that thought passing through my mind is not what condemns me. What condemns me is when I decide, I intend that I think I'll look a little longer, or I think I'll meditate in my mind a little bit more upon what if she and I could hook up. What would that be like? See, that's when it becomes lustful. So let's review rapidly. So what he is saying here is that looks, woman, and lustfully. He is telling us, he's using a specific term to give us a general principle, and that is looks. It's not just about the eyes as much as it is about the intent of the heart to find sexual arousal. Number two, it's not just about women. It's about anybody that would cause you to want a sexual relationship with them outside that which is appropriately sanctioned by God. And then number three, lust is not just a fleeting glance, an accidental moment where I saw something I shouldn't. It is actually a moment of concentration that is intended to bring me to a place of sexual arousal it's not appropriate before God. He's saying, be careful with that. Now, the reason it's so important to be careful with that is because what he's about to say in the next two verses, and we'll talk about that next time. Sonny Childs, God bless you. Be there, Matthew 16:26. We are the Sonny Childs and Family Ministries, serving as missionaries to this great nation. Please pray for us and consider adding us to your missions giving.